The next speaker is someone I'm really pleased to introduce. Dr. Nic Berente is Associate Professor in Mendoza College of Business at Notre Dame University and Associate Professor in Information Systems at Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. He has received numerous awards for his teaching and research, and is the Associate Editor for Management Information Systems Quarterly, a key journal in the field. His research focuses on how digital innovation drives large-scale change in organizations and institutions, and has been principal investigator on numerous NSF awards, focusing on a variety of different topics. One that is particularly relevant today is the development of a prototype Vortex, Virtual Organizations, Resources, and Toolkits Exchange, that helps science leaders run their large-scale enterprises more efficiently. In addition, he was an entrepreneur prior to joining the Academy and has founded 2 technology companies. Please welcome Dr. Berente.
Well, good morning. Nic Berente, and I'm at a business school. Am I the first person at a business school we've seen, I think? All right. And a lot of what Jim was talking about, metrics, that's the language of business, right? For those of you who come from business or work with businesses, right, a lot of what we do is done by way of metrics and measurement, and that's what we teach our students, and that's how our future managers manage what they do, right, when they go out into the world. That's the executives, that's the MBAs, they use metrics, they measure. And you know, there's the old adage, you get what you measure, right? And it's true for both good and for bad. So be careful about what you measure because you're going to mobilize and prioritize resources in that direction, right? So you need to measure. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why you need to measure and some ideas for measurement, okay, today. So my research involves, in part, next-generation research enterprises, right? This is what I've done, and of course, next-generation computationally intensive, we like to call it. We're in the digital age, right? We're no longer in the industrial age. Many of our institutions were set up in the industrial or even the agricultural age, and many of those institutions are being overturned or changed in the digital age, and I love to research that in its many forms. My dissertation was on NASA, and I've been studying and working with organizations, largely cyber infrastructure organizations, some of the bigger projects in computer science in that group. I haven't worked too much with engineering folks in their centers yet with NSF, but we have this idealized view of what research is, right? And we maybe inherit it from industrial or pre-industrial age, right? And it's the mad scientist working in his lab. Yes, usually him, but we can, of course, update that a little to say it's not the mad scientist that we have in this idealized view or this romantic view, but you know, they might have a dutiful little grad student working with them as well, right? And that's what we think about. We think about our lab. We think, and then of course the reality of contemporary science we all know, right? Atlas, CERN, 100 countries, right? 10,000 researchers, probably more, and engineers and scientists and such. 140 supercomputer centers directly crunching the data from this puppy, right? So that's a serious bit of science going on. So really, science nowadays is distributed, it's computationally intensive, and we all see this with our own work. Science and engineering activity, right, research, it involves all of this stuff, right? And somewhere in between, that individual working with the grad student and the Large Hadron Collider, we have what we call research enterprises or science enterprises. We've referred to them as science enterprises in the past. I realize I'm talking to ERC, so we'll call them science and engineering enterprises, right? And if you think of these research enterprises, what are they? It could be a project, it could be an institute, a center, so on and so forth, right? These are all the enterprises. They can be, and there are different vehicles we use for different purposes. There are actually people who study these things. And what we're finding, and they're distributed, they're across multiple universities, many different people, increasingly with convergence, cross-disciplinary, right? And this is the question. All of a sudden, those scientists, those engineers, those people who were into their question are now answering questions that have nothing to do with their research. Like, why should we fund you? Why should we continue to fund you? Why shouldn't we, and I've run into this with some of the groups I'm working with, why shouldn't we decrease your funding? Right? We funded you now for a couple of years. You're doing fine. we think we can get the same outcomes for less money. Why don't we just cut your budget, right? I know a lot of enterprises are worried about that currently, and they have actually since I've been working with them in the last decade or so. Certainly with NASA during my dissertation, they were worried about cuts to their funding, and they actually ran into a number of them. And then since then, a number of science enterprises were talking about cuts to their funding, right? Now, what's interesting is as some enterprises did get cuts to their funding, others actually got increases. How do you get an increase in your funding when they're doing blanket cuts? Well, I'm going to tell you the secret to getting increases in your funding when they're doing blanket cuts, right? And it's all about value. And I know you've heard about value yesterday. I know you've heard about value proposition, but that's what commerce is, right? I'm in a business school. All business is exchanging value for value. If people don't find what you're doing valuable, they're not going to buy it, period. If people think what you're doing is valuable and they can afford it, they'll buy more of it, right? And value is, of course, the importance or worth of something, right? And there's an important aspect of value. So let's just look at this. This is a painting. To me, and look at it. Do you like this painting? And, you know, art is in the eye by the beholder. I personally, you know, and this goes to show you how little I know about art, and maybe, you know, this may affront some of you, but I look at that and think, yeah, it's some blocks of color. I'm not too into it, but my wife is into this sort of thing. So I asked her, I said, come over and look at my computer, and you think we can put this in our dining room or maybe our entryway or something like that? Would this be valuable to you? Do you want it? And she's like, well, no, the colors are all wrong. I'm going for this color scheme. So clearly me, I look at this and don't think it's any value at all because I'm not into that kind of art, right? I like guys on horses with swords and things, right? This to me is not a valuable piece of art. To my wife, it's not valuable because it doesn't match her color scheme, right? But apparently to someone, it's worth $186 million, okay? It's expressionist art. It's Mark Rothko, and it's his number 6, and the idea was for you to you know, project your own understanding on it, right? But that's the idea about value, right? We're all talk about value proposition, but again, it's a cliche. Value for whom? Well, value for your stakeholders. And here's the deal. What you're interested in, and I've worked with a number of researchers, usually what researchers are interested in is not what your funders are interested in. Maybe there's some overlap. You know, you can think of Venn diagrams. There's some things you're both interested in. But for the most part, what you're interested in, what they're interested in are two different things. All right? And when you get that figured out, then you know, we'll start making progress. And what you're interested in, or at least maybe me as a researcher, you know, I'm interested in number of publications, the status of the journal in which I'm publishing, number of citations, right? We heard from Dr. Lawrenson this morning that, you know, 3,500 citations make a career. So I'm looking forward to getting 3,500 citations one day. Certainly grant funding, that sort of thing. This is what we're all interested in. And maybe some of the people who give us money are interested in some of these things. But, and you've seen logic models. Did anybody go over a logic model yesterday with you? NSF, all right, logic model, no one did a logic model. Logic models are super important for running an organization, particularly centers. Most center leaders that I've talked to, and I'm not going to get too much into logic models, but a logic model is a way of understanding your organization, right? And your organization has inputs, that's you. You know, the leader, the people you hire, maybe the money that comes in, so on and so forth. Then there are the processes, right? Like C-Sync does this cool iterative process, right? That's what they do, that's the behaviors. And then there are the outputs, right? And you can, and you'll see logic models in different ways, by the way. There's no one standard logic model, but this is a pretty good one. But it's the, you know, it's system, input, process, output. And the outputs, really, you can think of those in two different ways, right? They're the outcomes of the group. C-Sync maybe has some outcomes they're interested in, like publications, maybe like, you know, getting people in the door and coming back in the door and then visiting them on a frequent basis, right? These are outcomes that are really, really interesting to them. But maybe their funders aren't that interested in that. Maybe their funders want to see them change U.S. environmental policy or something. They want to see something really big impact. And if they're not going to see that, they want to see certain things like that, right? So what we generally find is that researchers are interested in outcomes, whereas their funders are interested in impacts, All right, so that's the difference between outcomes and impacts, or at least my difference that I construct. And I would argue that there are 4 different dimensions along which our funders are interested in our impact. And the first is science findings, right? Scientific findings. As we all grow our third arms, right, our funders are interested in growing third arms, or whatever it is that our stretch goal that we're shooting for. And really, if you saw, Dr. Lawrenson, a lot of what he did today had a tremendous impact on me, and they were just science stories, really. They were stories of what he was able to do with, and that has a tremendous impact. So people are interested in those stories. They're interested in those qualitative stories of what you're up to. And in cases of, say, NSF and some others, they are maybe interested in publication citations, that sort of maybe take-up of your scientific findings. So the scientific findings are not the only, but certainly an important impact that you want to be able to describe. There are a number of different ways to do this, but one is, science cases. Just tell the story and tell it in a really compelling way, like Dr. Lawrenson. Another thing your funders are going to be interested in is economic impact, right? They want to see dollars. Now, maybe not NSF, because NSF gives you dollars, but maybe your university is really excited that you're bringing in NSF dollars, right? So, and maybe your state is interested that you're bringing in dollars. Maybe your city, there are different folks who are interested in economic return. Your spouse likes to see economic return. So those are 2 dimensions. Certain stakeholders are going to want to see science outcomes, and those people who want to see economic returns maybe aren't as interested in your science outcomes. The other thing that certainly NSF is interested in, but so are your states and other stakeholders, is workforce development. This is big, and it's only getting bigger, particularly those of us in STEM fields, right? We should be ringing the bell on workforce development a little more than we are. And then finally, innovation. Right? And this, when you talk about innovation, right, we can think in terms of translational technologies, which engineering actually does a wonderful job at, but also startups, other forms of innovation, right? So those are the 4 dimensions of value. And, we're scientists. We're researchers. We think of ourselves in the lab, but now what I'm doing is telling you got to communicate value, right? And you're thinking, oh man, but I'm not a salesman, right? That's Don Draper from Mad Men. He's a marketing guy. He's a marketing buzzsaw. He's going to sell my product for me. I need one of them. I'm a researcher. I'm an engineer. I'm a scientist. You can't expect me to sell. Well, you sold enough to get yourself an ERC, and you have to continue selling. And now you're going to have to continue selling for the life of your, right? And once you get to understand that, you are going to have to take on this sales role, that helps, right? And that's what we all have to become. We all have to become these researcher salesmen and salespeople, right? And it's about communicating value. Sales is not selling someone something they don't need, right? Sales is all about just communicating value. Look at what we're doing that's valuable. And some of the best salespeople I've seen in industry were not particularly, your typical slap and tickle, take you out to lunch and schmooze you. You don't have to be a schmoozer to be a salesman. You just have to solve people's problems and demonstrate that you're valuable. And then people throw money at you, okay? That's selling. Selling is simply about communicating value, all right? And the number one way to communicate value is to understand value. You can't make it up. You have to actually understand the value you're bringing to your stakeholder, and then once you understand it, you can communicate it. And if you're not bringing any value, it's hard to communicate it, right? Because it's not there. That's when you have to become the shyster, right? So there's a simple rule to follow. The first is you want to figure out what you're communicating or understanding the value, because the 2 are the same thing. Understanding the value you bring and communicating the value you bring are exactly the same thing. First, you have to understand what you're talking about. Are you talking about you and your career, or are you talking about your enterprise? Is it the center, right? It's the ERC that you're interested in. So that's the first thing. Check the box. Which enterprise am I talking about? And then you have to figure out which stakeholder. Is it my federal agency? Is it Congress, right? Remember, NSF's big stakeholder is Congress. You can try, and remember, NSF is filled with a bunch of researchers, engineers, and scientists just like you. They might not be any better at communicating value. They may actually be worse than you at communicating value. So when you give them what they are looking for, what they really want is something to give to Congress, right? So you can think of Congress as you can think of your state and your region, right? People get a lot of funds from their state and their region. They also, their universities in particular. I was at the University of Georgia before Notre Dame, and the state of Georgia was very interested in everything the University of Georgia was doing. And then there's the general population, right? Certainly Dr. Lawrence's stuff this morning is totally interesting to the general population, and I think a lot of the stuff in this room is. And then other scientists, of course, and so on and so forth. So who is the stakeholder we're talking about? And then finally, which dimension of value? Are we talking science, economic, workforce, or innovation? Okay? And if you follow those three steps, you'll be you'll do a pretty good job, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little exercise here. And the first thing we would do is identify the important stakeholders. Second thing we're going to do is we're not going to get into value propositions of stakeholders. They talked about value propositions yesterday, right? So think about a value proposition. What is in it? What's in it for that particular stakeholder? There are key performance indicators. We'll get into that in a second. So let me just give you an example. One of the organizations I worked with, NCSA in Illinois. It's National Computational. It's a big supercomputer center in Illinois. So I'll give you an example of just working for them. If we just did a quick and dirty one, we might say that if we look at this matrix, we look at our stakeholders along the vertical axis, we look at the dimensions of value, and then we figure out that not every stakeholder is interested in every dimension of value, right? So maybe NSF's interested in innovation and science, maybe the state of Illinois is interested in economic, the university is interested in, workforce, for example. So we look at that, and we might say, okay, well, what specifically are they interested in? We think about some more specifics. Not only do we start with what category they're interested in, but what's the value proposition that we're really we're making for that stakeholder. And then the other thing we want to keep in mind when we talk about stakeholders, and in the sense of NCSA, there's not just the 4 dimensions of value that I brought that are impact, there's also outcome level value as well that they bring to NSF. For example, NCSA has to deliver cycles of supercomputer time, right? So that may be something operational that NCSA is interested in, but also maybe a stakeholder is interested in. So you can add an operational line if you're interested. Another thing you might do is realize that there are different of the same stakeholder category. For example, there are Congress people who are friendly to science, and there are Congress people who are unfriendly to science spending. So you might actually treat those as 2 different stakeholders and address them in a different way. Similarly at National Science Foundation, right? There might be the folks in your directorate who funded you, who are invested in your success, and then there are maybe those who want the money that went to you, right? So you could look at each stakeholder as multidimensional, right? In your university, there are different, it's not a homogeneous singular entity. Right? So you could really dig into this quite a bit and play with stakeholders and play to the value you might bring to different stakeholders, right? All right, and then you specify that. Oh, geez, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a 2-part exercise. The first part of the exercise is just identify your stakeholders. There's a sheet of paper in the middle of everyone's table, there should be anyway, where you have 5 things across the top of the sheet of paper. And you all have to do this independently. Even if you're in the same group, you're not allowed to talk to each other, right? And you have to start writing out the stakeholders and go ahead and be specific. You can put check boxes in the middle if you'd like, if you want to think through the dimension of value that each stakeholder is interested in. But what I'd most like you to do right now is just write down all the stakeholders that matter to you. And if there are 2 under NSF, put the 2 types of stakeholders under NSF, for example, or your university or that sort of thing. So just take 5 minutes independently, don't talk, and do that. We're hopefully identifying our stakeholders. By the way, that's just part 1 of the exercise. You're going to continue on to part 2 in a minute. So think it through. That you have all your key stakeholders at least. You don't have to worry about it too much. The next thing, after you've identified your stakeholders, is we have to figure out how we're going to communicate our value. And the best way to communicate our value, again, as I said, was to understand it. The best way to understand it is to measure it somehow. Okay? And this is our good friend Bill Gates, who basically points out that measurement is a big part of mobilizing action, right? And every good leader he knows is all about measuring things. They measure this, they measure that, they tweak their measurements. They're always looking at measurements. That's the deal. Now that you're leaders, I realize that a lot of folks in the last day and a half have been talking to you about leadership and about a lot of the intrinsic qualities of leaders and a lot about the processes of leaders, and they're 100% right. All of this is incredibly important, so I don't want to take away from that, but now I'm going to give you, all right, in industry, what is happening is leaders manage through measurement, okay, in no small part. It's not the only thing they do, but it's a very, very important part of what leaders do. So you're going to hear the term metric, okay? And a metric is just that, it's a measurement. And there's some rules about metrics, okay? It has to be specific, and it has to be measurable. And ideally, you want a quantity and a quality metric for everything important, okay? So let's say we're delivering trainings, right? You want to talk about how many students you're training, and there are classic metrics too, by the way, for all sorts of different processes. You want to be clear about how many students you're training, but if you're doing a really bad job at training them, you know, you could train thousands of students, but if you're doing a bad job, you're not delivering much value. So you need something quality, something indicating that I'm doing a good job training those 1,000 students, okay? But it's also important to note that what sells is the quantity. When you're trying to influence another person, and you tell them we did 1,000 of these or 1,000,000 of these, that matters more than our quality rating is we get a 4.8 out of 5. Right? Without the quality doesn't stand alone. The quality helps people understand quantity measures, right? So remember that, quantity sells. Now, a certain type of metric, you're going to hear the term key performance indicator, or KPI. And a key performance indicator is simply a metric that I think is really important, and I'm going to run my organization around this metric. You can measure a lot of things, but then there are certain things that are key. Those are your key performance indicators. And a key performance indicator should have a title, it should have a description, it should have the metric, the way that you measure it, and a target. You've heard of 6 Sigma, right? That's my defects per million that I'm going to allow. That's my target. And then I can always assess, not only to communicate value, but to understand what I'm doing. I can always assess what I'm doing in relation to that target, right? So that's a KPI. We're short of time, but I do want to tell you this. I don't know if anybody here knows John King, my postdoc mentor at University of Michigan and my good friend. And this is what he said. And when he's talking about selling, he says numbers beat no numbers every time, right? If you show up for a conversation, when you're in an argument, and the other person has numbers, you lose the argument, right? If you're going for funding, it's you and someone else, you have numbers, the person you're up against doesn't, you'll get the funding. Right? So numbers beat no numbers every time. Maybe it shouldn't be that way. Maybe we all know numbers don't measure the full richness of life. Yes, absolutely. Maybe what we're measuring is absolutely wrong. I'm not going to argue with any of that, but when you're trying to influence someone, numbers work. So let me give you a quick little bit about putting numbers into perspective. Let's say I have a training center, okay? And we trained 820 student hours of training in some period of time. Say a year or a month or something. Is that good? What do you think? Who wants to tell me if that's good or not? 820. Is that a good number? We don't know, right? And that's because we need to contextualize numbers. And there are a number of different ways to contextualize numbers. I'm going to give you 3. The first is we have a target, right? And this is the KPI. You know, we completed 820, but our target was 600. Are we doing well? Yeah. How about this one? We completed 820, and it's 10% above last year, which is 20% above the year before that. Is that pretty good? Yeah. And better yet, if I draw some kind of picture of it, right? Then it really hits home. And then the last one, and this is what people hate doing, especially in science and research enterprises, right? And that's put the amount of money you spent. And this is the all-powerful number, by the way. It's the return on investment. We actually say, look, for our $50,000 budget, we completed 820. That's $61 per student hour. Okay, now if we can have an industry benchmark showing that your typical student hour is 120, then we can combine these, right? We can combine a target with ours and so on and so forth. But this is one way of getting at return on investment. Now I can look at NSF or whoever's funding me and I can say, look, I'm doing it for $61 and can you do that? No, you can't. No one can do that, right? That type of return on investment where you actually pay attention to the investment, not just the return, is the powerful way to get at numbers, right? And if we look at numbers, when you manage your organization, of course, hopefully, you're going to be looking at the strategy. You have your vision, mission, and goals. Then you have your strategic objectives. Then your strategic objectives can be decomposed into your tactical and operational goals, and then each of those are going to have a measure, right? You're going to have your KPIs, key performance indicators for the high level, and then you're going to have metrics for anything in that logic model that we talked about. You're going to have metrics for everything that's how you're going to manage your organization through measurement, right? That's how you'll understand how well you're doing. I keep hitting the wrong button. And then there are your strategic and there are your operational metrics, right? And oftentimes your operational metrics will either sweep up into your strategic metrics or you'll pick key indicators out of your operational metrics, and you'll say, I'm going to use this as a proxy for a strategic metric, right? So let me just give you some examples again from NCSA, who we worked with, and let's say there's a national competitiveness metric, and I'll just give you a couple examples of some metrics that we talked about there. I'll give you one creative metric, and we got this from, and this is the Jewish diaspora of 1946 to 1951 from around the world, right? Through World War II, Jewish people kind of left Europe and went a variety of places. And we looked at this and we were thinking, hey, that's kind of cool, isn't it? From a standpoint of showing how people leave one place and go many, many other places, right? So we decided to do that with NCSA. And we cut out Illinois because Illinois was, of course, the biggest arrow. But we were able to show in the upper left there the diaspora of NCSA, right? The states that NCSA is influencing. And we were able to show in particular, first of all, the main thing that we showed that's not on this is that most of the people stay in Illinois, which is a good story for Illinois. But look, a lot of people are going to California. And then we look at the firms that they're going to, and a lot go to Caterpillar, which is right there in Illinois. But look at what else we're doing. We're upskilling the United States at NCSA. We're sending people to Google, Microsoft, right? All these, not only industrial, but tech companies as well. And we're upskilling California, right? Isn't this a great story about workforce development for NCSA, right? And it's a visual story. So if you look at NCSA, there are a number of things they do well. If you go to Exceed, I don't know if you're familiar with Exceed, it's the Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment. If you go to Exceed's website, they do a really good job with science cases, right? Kind of like how Dr. Lawrenson was telling you about his research in this very vivid way with nice pictures. Well, that's what we're talking about here. They do a good job with nice pictures. So if I were to give you an exemplar, go look at some of the stuff that Exceed is doing with its science outcomes and try to do that with your engineering outcomes, right, when you're doing your science cases. Another thing they did a really good job of with, and this is the Blue Waters project, is they did a really good job talking about economic returns to the project, right? Because, they had to build a building. They got, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're basically sent to Illinois, and they're basically saying they brought in $1 billion of economic value to the state of Illinois. And there are a number of different ways they did that, right? And then, of course, there's through the SBIR programs and that sort of thing, they're paying attention to innovation, right? So just some things to think about, and now what we're going to do is finish up with the last bit. And this is what I'd like you to do. Look at those stakeholders, look at those dimensions of value, and come up with a metric. You have a couple minutes to do it. Come up with a way that I'm going to measure this and assess how I'm doing. And we already know that science cases are out there, so you can't take that one. You have to come up with something else that's clever. And you have to do it in the next couple minutes, and then you're going to share it with the neighbors at your table, your favorite one, okay? So first take a couple minutes in silence, write out what your measurement will be that's clever about your ERC, and then I'm going to tell you when to share, so don't share yet. This is what, I know we could talk about this all day, and the good news is you can talk about this for the duration of your ERC, right? So this will be out there. Now, we've got a couple of people walking around with microphones. What I would like you to do is to name a cool measure We're just going to ask a couple of people to do this that someone else at the table came up with. So now's your chance to brag for your neighbor. So I'd like at least 2 hands up in the group for people whose neighbors, someone at their table, came up with something that was kind of interesting to them. Anyone? Come on, we need 2 interesting metrics, or I'll cold call. Do we have one? All right. There's our first one, and then I need a second hand. Yes.
I heard it. I can see yours, though.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So someone else at my table came up with this one. So the stakeholder is NGOs, such as food banks, for example. And the economic measure, one definition of it is participants who are connected to the agencies via the computerized system and other kinds of things that the ERC has generated, and then eventually a reduction in cost to reach people in need for those food bank
beautiful.
agencies.
Yeah, so it's the number of people. So here we have an equation, right? Sometimes there's and you want to think through what's the numerator, what's the denominator, right? So it's not only number of people connected, but then reduction of cost per number of person connected. So that's very cool, absolutely. And that would sell, right, to people who are interested in this. One more. Yes.
Someone at our table came up with insurance companies. While we were focused on other, the general public and federal agencies, they came up with insurance companies with economic impact to specific companies with decrease in claims and increase in profit, but also on the innovation side, they would get better algorithms to do their calculations, which drives their profit. Yeah.
Very cool. An interesting stakeholder, one we usually don't think of. Absolutely. And another thing, too, when you think about value, you brought up insurance, right? There are 2 ways you demonstrate value, right? One is it actually brings a benefit. The other is it mitigates some harm, right? And of course, one is cost reduction, right? And in the short term, right, you give someone a benefit or maybe reduce the cost. In the long term, we consider mitigating harm, right? We think of it as insurance. And a long-term benefit we think of as an investment, right? So keep in mind to think in terms of insurance and investment for maybe some of the outcomes you're interested in. Okay, so with that said, hopefully I've at least sold you on the idea, or at least got you thinking that, wait a second, I need to sell. I need to be a scientist that can sell. I need to be the combination of mad scientist and Don Draper that's up here going forward. And I don't just communicate it like some huckster car salesman, but what I do is I understand and I let the data, right, say what value I'm providing, okay? And as our speakers have said earlier today, I think Jim, you might have mentioned this, but you got to get it in the culture of your enterprise, right? It can't be like a slapped on top, right? If you measure, and that's important to your enterprise, it will actually influence your enterprise and make it stronger. There are some additional materials I can point you to. There are 2 reports we did from some of the many workshops and what we call science executive education sessions that are available online. Those are the links. One's called Thinking Like a Science Executive. The other's called Leading Cyber Infrastructure Enterprises. It's for cyber infrastructure, but it applies more broadly, right? It's about enterprises. And then we have this website that we started, and it's going. It's called Distributed Science. That's my friend James Howison at Texas. He's at the iSchool there, and it's called distributedscience.ischool.utexas.edu. And under there, we have these guides, and it's like how to structure a virtual organization, how to run a virtual meeting. There are some other little guides. Some of what you've seen here about metrics and communicating, we've tried to put in there. So we made, I don't know, about 6 or 8 guides that are on that website. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was terrific. We've got just a few minutes for questions for the 3 speakers that have just finished up. And then I want to remind you that lunch is going to be brought in here, so stay put, and we'll have a speaker during lunch. So is there anyone who has a question for any of the speakers we've just heard from? Or do you all want lunch? Okay. Oh, sorry. Here we go.
I have a question for Margaret. So I think that the role of going out and seeking new projects continually is a really brave one. And that means that you've got to reserve a certain portion of your budget for new stuff So what kind of balance do you maintain between existing stuff and new stuff?
So you're not going to like the answer, which is that we have enough money, we don't even have to worry about it. I know. That's, and it's, I hope you didn't hear that. No, I'm partially, it's really true, but the fact is it really ends up being about 90% our core programs and stuff that comes into us that we partially shape because we have themes. But then at least 10% are things any one of the leadership teams says, you know, we really should think about this. Who out there in the research community might we want to give a subaward to get them to come in and start to spearhead this? So, yes, please.
And just one, our center, I think, is a little different than the ones you're proposing. Our whole mission is to set up all of these new teams, basically, whereas my understanding is these centers will have a kind of fixed in-house capacity, and that goes to your question, is how do you find that? We don't quite have the same tension that these centers will have.
There's a question in the back.
Yes, this question is for Nic. I enjoyed your presentation, but a lot of us work at universities, and we're kind of on the receiving end of this now, where there's a lot of metrics getting kind of pushed down to, you know, student credit hours and publications and citations. And my experience is that sometimes that almost gets to be kind of balkanizing. It's the opposite of convergence. It discourages things that aren't easily measured, aren't easily quantified. How do you deal with that sort of thing?
Yeah, you nailed it, right? The problem with metrics is there's an upside, right? You can communicate certain things better. The downside is you get what you measure, and people, it's like this awful weapon that people misuse, right? And just because you look and you have and I'm at a university as well, right? So far, Notre Dame's not as bad as maybe other universities I've been part of as far as managing by metric, right? But whoever's running this, the metrics that I've seen are doing it wrong. So the problem is people hear about metrics, they start measuring, and then they do it inappropriately in not well thought out ways. So we all have a bad taste in our mouth from having seen horrible implementations of metrics that lead to dysfunctional behaviors, right? So yeah, I've seen it, you've seen it, and it happens in business too, right? Now, to say that because we've seen that, now we're going to throw metrics out and just not measure anything is kind of, I think the answer is we just need to make sure in our ERC we do a better job measuring, right? And, you know, I mentioned Exceed. It's a 10-year project, in its 8th year. We're still adjusting the measurements based on what we've come up with in the last 5 years, right? And, it's just the nature of the beast. But just because they're bad in your experience doesn't mean you shouldn't measure things. You should just make them better.